Hi everyone, welcome to the 360-degree feedback as a Catalyst for Change webinar. We are so pleased to have you all here. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Dale Rose, President of 3D Group. Dr. Rose is an industrial organizational psychologist with a passion for leadership. Throughout his career, Dr. Rose has been an active author, publishing many peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on employee survey methods, consulting best practices, and 360-degree feedback. Without further ado, I am so very pleased to introduce you, our presenter today, Dr. Dale Rose.
Thank you, Justine, and thank you, Barbara. I'm certainly happy to be here and happy to be talking about one of my favorite topics, actually both of them really, 360-degree feedback and change. I'm going to be talking today about how 360 feedback can be used to affect change. I think in many cases, that's what people have in mind when they implement it, though not always. We've been doing this work for about 20 years and just have a real passion for 360 feedback. And as part of that process, we've been, this is actually going to be the fourth time in over 10 years that we've done a benchmark study of current practices in 360. So what I'm going to be doing here is kind of overlaying the results from that study from over 200 companies with this notion of how do we use 360-degree feedback for change, so we can look at what kinds of decisions companies are making today as they try to use 360 to make improvements in their organizations. So just a quick overview in terms of the agenda for today. We're going to cover sort of three big topics, and then as Justine mentioned, there'll be a Q&A opportunity at the end. So the first is just a little bit of framing around what are those conditions for change, what are the things that you need to be doing to really get change out of a 360 process. And then as we go through each of the different conditions, I'm going to then bring in benchmark study results to sort of see what sort of decisions organizations have made that support, or in some cases don't support, that framework. Then we'll move to just a quick bit on the future of 360 feedback. We got some really interesting data from the companies that participated, and so getting a sense from them about what the future of our field looks like. And then of course Q&A. So feel free to bring those in as we go, and then we'll field them at the end. Okay, so one of the interesting things when we do these studies is that we find that when someone tells me, oh, we do 360-degree feedback at my company, I often don't know much about what they're doing. There's so many different options, so many different ways to do 360s, everything from interviews to personality-based, all kinds of different approaches. So I thought I'd just do a real quick, basic frame for us. When we say 360-degree feedback, these are the basics we're thinking about. So we're thinking survey-based rather than an interview, and these were all the conditions for the participation in the study as well. So it's survey-based feedback. It's about workplace behavior. So this isn't personality or how well you get along with your family or things like that. And then, of course, the notion of multi-rater, that there are multiple sources. These four tend to be the most typical sources, but the most important element here is that there are multiple sources that are all providing feedback using this methodology. There's some discussion among experts and others around the place of self-surveys, but in our view, it's a critical piece in terms of that self-awareness. So in any case, multiple sources, workplace behavior, and survey-based feedback. So when we say 360, that's really what we're talking about. So let's take a quick glance also at what the study looked like, so you've got an idea of kind of where some of the data are going to be coming from. So really happy to be releasing, I think, our best study of all the four that we've done here. We've been doing this for a little over a decade, actually. This is the fourth study that we've done. We do them about every 3 or 4 years to kind of capture what are those current practices. Lots out there in terms of best practice, and you can buy 1 million books on what you should do. But it's always interesting to us to see how that contrasts, or in some cases aligns with what actual practice looks like. And I think learning from both of those as an organization trying to implement 360 is important. So in this study, we had over 200 companies representing 30 industries, so very good, solid representative sample. We go through sort of 22 design decisions. So the premise is, if you were going to be designing a 360, what kind of decisions would you need to go through in order to design that well? And we want to find out what other companies are doing as they make each one of those steps. Another important decision that we've made in this research is that we, in all of our studies, no more than 5% of the companies are from our own client base. We certainly don't want a whole bunch of, this is what 3D Group does in 360. We really want a cross-section and capture across the country what those trends look like. So, as I mentioned, we'll be looking into some very specific results throughout the webinar here that came from this study. So anytime I'm mentioning, here's what the findings were, this is specifically what I'm going to be getting to. We probably won't cover every single design decision, every single question, but I think we will get a good cross-section, and in particular, we're going to get a good cross-section that relates to this notion of change. So, again, as I mentioned, as a framework for change, our point of view is that 360 feedback is best used to create change. It's best used to create a sense of where do I need to grow, develop, change, etc. A lot of different contexts you can do that with, whether it's for development or promotion, for example. Both of those are change. We're not in the middle of that one, but the notion of using it for moving forward one way or another. When we think about change and think about what are those kind of basic conditions, what are those key things that you really need in order to create change in a 360, I would contend that there really are three critical components. So accountability, relevant content, and credible data. If you have all three of these components, then you have a hope for change. The interesting thing here is that if you've got relevant content but you don't have credible data, so I asked the right questions, but you don't really believe that the data were computed properly or the right people filled the survey out, well, it doesn't really matter how good those questions were if the data aren't useful. So again, having the two of those is important, but even if you believe the data and it's the right question, but I'm not really going to hold you accountable for actually creating change, it may or may not come to the top of your priority list in terms of what you're going to do. So I would argue that really, even two of these is not enough. You need to have some accountability for actually making change and changing who you are. One of the things that change theorists have said for a long time is the status quo wins. Change is difficult. We tend to resist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and really kind of bucket our results according to each one of these three areas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what each area is and why it's relevant for change, and then again we'll look at the data from the benchmark study to see what kinds of decisions companies are typically making that support or contradict these core concepts. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is relevant content. Seems to make sense to start where the survey is. The first thing you've got to do, of course, is to figure out what questions are going to be asked. So when we think about relevant content, I really like this quote from Bossidy and Sharon, the notion that 360 content can be sort of aspirational. If you can set out what are those behaviors that we expect of our leaders, and use a 360 to assess people against that, it's going to drive culture. It's going to be able to move your organization forward. Now, this is also a really important lens changer as well. One of the things that we find in our study is that a number of organizations use 360s for individual-only change, but then also a large percentage use it for organization change or systems change. So, for example, a department. So really this ability, and one of the real values I think of 360s is its ability to go at that individual level, but then also aggregate outward to a more systems-wide approach. So let's dig in and look at what some actual survey content might look like to get a feel for what I'm really talking about here. So here's an example of an item that you might see in a 360. Generates innovative solutions to customer problems. Now here's this is a great example because it gives you the notion of the importance of relevance. So when I look at this, this can be a very relevant item, or it can be a very irrelevant item. For example, I look at this and I think, well, gee, does the person who's trying to get the feedback to create change, do they even interact with customers? If they don't interact with customers, giving them feedback on this is not going to help them change much. Now, that's at the individual level. Now, another way to look at this, I talked about content being kind of aspirational. Well, if you look at this and you say, gee, we really need more innovative solutions to customer problems, that's our problem organizationally, this can be a great way to drive leaders and others toward innovative solutions by showing them that that's what's important. On the other hand, imagine your organization is one that really doesn't need innovative solutions. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What you need is people to follow the sort of well-established approaches that have been set up to address customer problems. And what you're facing is people being a little bit too creative. So you've got kind of from an organizational standpoint two different perspectives. Use content like this in that circumstance, it's going to go counter to where you're headed. So instead, you might use an item like this. Follows established procedure when dealing with customers. So these two content items, I think, illustrate the way in which content can really help drive an organization forward based on their strategy or their needs in terms of what's going on organizationally. So you can see this notion of choosing between innovative solutions versus established procedure, making that content relevant is going to drive change in the direction that you want to see it go. Okay, so let's see if we can systematize this a little bit and think about a little bit more about the types of relevance that you might see. So one level we just talked about is organizational relevance, right? So if I go in and I use an item like makes customers a top priority, but I'm doing this in a university, I can tell you, we've got a number of university clients, they're not real fond of referring to students as customers. So I'm going to go instead with makes students a top priority, which will work great in that university, but perhaps may not be quite as effective when it comes to thinking about customer focus in, say, a hospital where patients may be a more appropriate reference point. So organizational level relevance, again, very, very important. Another kind of relevance to consider is having to do with job domain. So an R&D focus might be more on follows procedures to assure quality, where sales may be more acts with a sense of urgency. So if you're trying to create change within an R&D department or a sales department, again, if you flip-flop these, it may just provide some sort of counter directional feedback. On the other hand, it could be that maybe you want your R&D group to act with more of a sense of urgency, and maybe you want sales to follow more procedure. But again, that ability to kind of look at how does this fit with the job and the organization. Okay, and then last, job level. So for managers, delegating tasks appropriately is going to be very important, but working productively on team projects may not. So if you've got a manager or executive level, they may be thinking about, are they delegating appropriately? At an individual contributor level, it may just be working productively on team projects. Again, if you mix and match these inappropriately, you're really going to be in a tough spot in terms of getting the kind of change that you're looking for. So getting relevant content, absolutely critical to the success in terms of getting change moving where you want it to go. So let's take a look at what companies are doing and how they make their decisions around this topic of content. So one of the core questions, of course, has to do with, well, who really developed that? Who really developed that content? Is this something that you're getting from the outside, or is it something that you're developing internally? So when we look at the results, we find that it's pretty wide ranging. Everything from bought it right off the shelf to a consultant built it completely on their own from the outside, to kind of a blended, the internal committee teaming with the consultant, or maybe it's just really entirely internal. So each company's kind of coming up with their own approach. One of the things when I look at these data, though, that I think is interesting is to maybe do an overlay and to say, okay, one way to look at it is exactly 4/5 of the group did some customization. So there's clearly a strong trend in the direction of looking at survey content, trying to make it relevant and fit the environment. It's a pretty significant number of folks using bought off the shelf. So off the shelf, it's not that off the shelf doesn't allow you to have relevant content, but you do need to look closely at it to make sure that you've got you're driving the right behaviors with the right expectations. Another way to look at this is again getting more specific into those levels. So there's the question of what level of content were you using in terms of job level, and then also job function. So are people using different content by different job levels, or are they using all the same? So again, asking those over 200 companies, what do you do with your content? We find that the dominant solution is to use the same content for all participants. So that clearly is the majority, though significant minorities varying it by level and even by the participant's job. Now, I can tell you that one of the things about varying by job is that you can imagine you've got a lot of jobs in your organization. So building a new survey to fit each and every job within your organization can be quite cumbersome, and so there's always that opportunity cost from the HR perspective of how many of these do we need to build, and is there an opportunity for us to use sort of the same content at least across multiple jobs, if not across multiple levels. I think the push here for the same across participants again gets back to this notion of individual level development versus systems level development. If you're interested in systems level development, it's very, very helpful to have the same behaviors expected of leaders all across your organization, and then to be able to aggregate the data up and look and compare across the organization and see where your leaders are at on these different content areas. Again, you've got to be careful if there are radical variances in terms of, level and what those jobs look like. It may be difficult to do, but it seems that people end up on the for the most part on the idea of using the same across participants for the value there that you get in terms of efficiency and cost, and then also just the ability to look across the organization. So relevant content becomes a very, very important dimension to look at, and I think you've got to consider that anyone trying to build a 360 process needs to be thinking first about what is it exactly that we're trying to assess. But getting the right content isn't going to cover the entire process. As I mentioned, you're not going to get change even if you've got the best content if you don't think also about the credibility of the data. There's a lot of work that goes into credibility of data. Certainly, if anyone who's ever sat with a leader getting feedback, as I do all the time, this is one of the biggest things that they like to bring up from a resistance standpoint. If they're trying not to change, the credibility of the data is one of the first excuses that they're going to jump for in terms of trying to question whether they should or should not change and whether they should or should not believe the data. So when we think about credibility, there are kind of three core things that you want to think about. Trust in the process. So do I just trust the process in general? Do I trust that the feedback was given as promised, that it was anonymous, etc., that the ratings, that the accuracy of the ratings was good? That is, did my raters or did the raters in the department, etc., did they provide honest feedback, or were they motivated by some other desire in rating putting their ratings down that it really was just them either being vindictive, or maybe they're just trying to make me feel good, or they being honest. So again, if I've got that perspective, it's going to be very hard for me to take that input and use it to create change. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is the accurate interpretation of results. One of the things that we're seeing more and more is surveys in excess of 150 questions come up, or reports in excess of 100 pages that require several hours of training just to interpret the report. So if I'm coming at it from the perspective of how am I going to create change, how do I take these data, I need to understand the data, I need to understand the results. So making sure that that's happening, I think, is very, very important in terms of someone's ability to take the data. They could, if they misinterpret it, they're going to head in the wrong direction. So let's see how companies typically address these three different issues. But while we're doing this, and before we jump in, let's see if we can get a little bit of interactive action here and get your views. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do an audience poll. I'm going to ask you the same question that we asked our participants. So I'm going to give a couple, probably about 30 seconds to answer, and I believe as soon as I launch this here, it should be up on your screen.
So while we're waiting for the results of the poll, this might be a good opportunity to tell you a bit more about the benchmark study. One of the most exciting things about this study for me was the amazing pool of respondents we had this year. We had over 200 respondents for over 30 industries, from aerospace to retail. We had Fortune 500 companies like 3M and other giants of industry like PepsiCo and FedEx. We also had some great small businesses. We even had a representation from the local Napa Valley winery, Silver Oak Cellars, which makes one of my favorite Cabernets. Are you a fan of Silver Oaks, Dale?
Oh yeah, Silver Oak's got that Alexander Valley cab. It's hard to beat. Very, very hard to beat. Yeah, I was pretty impressed. The number of different companies we got was great, but also the texture of them. I think, when you look through, you really can see when you look through the list, you get a pretty wide range. We do have one other poll, so you will have a chance. So, pardon me for the slip up there. So, in any case, think for yourself. What percentage of companies, if you think about it, if you've participated in a 360 program either as a participant yourself or running a program, think to yourself for just a moment, what percent? Well, it turns out that just over 55% of companies report that they felt employees had complete trust in the process. There's a couple ways you can kind of look at this. On the one hand, it's, I certainly would love to see it up higher. I'd love to see it in the 70s, 80s. I guess, the optimist would see it in the 90s. The realist maybe a little lower. But I think this notion of complete trust is a really critical one to consider. People have you're asking people to provide feedback about their manager that may not be glowing. It may be a bit of a surprise, but it turns out that not all managers are stellar, and so those that need to change need to hear the feedback. But in order to get that feedback, people providing it need to trust the process. They need to trust that their livelihoods, that their careers are not going to be in jeopardy if they give that honest feedback. So I was actually heartened here that that in terms of complete trust, a majority of the companies felt that their process was built in such a way that really the participants did trust it. On the other hand, let's be honest, as practitioners here, we do have room to grow. So I think we need to be vigilant. We need to be continuing to be thoughtful about trust of the participants, but also the people that are providing the data, and making sure to protect their trust in the process. So another critical aspect of trust has to do with how you introduce the program. I think there were some really interesting findings here, because that notion of how do you ask people, or how do you introduce people to what a 360 process is. When you ask people, what is 360, as I mentioned, people are all over the map in terms of what it is, what it means, how it's used. So introducing it, its purpose, the processes, answering questions, things like this is a very critical dimension, and can frankly make or break a program in terms of its receptivity from the employees, particularly on a first-time basis. The first time you introduce 360, it's a lot bigger issue than one client I've worked with for 6 or 7 years in a row, and by now they're pretty comfortable with it, and the orientation needs to be perhaps a little bit less intense. So when we look at those companies and see how do they introduce them, we get some pretty interesting results here. You can see clearly, HR, sort of that formal orientation, is the most common, the modal response, if you will. You can see that on the flip side of it, a formal orientation by the consultant that's assisting is far less prevalent. Still there, but far less prevalent. When I looked at this, one of the things that occurred to me is that really the personal approach. So if you look at sort of the first one there, the formal orientation a third one down one-on-one, discussing it during a meeting, formal orientation. All of those are sort of interactive. So 2/3 of the data here represent interactive ways of introducing the program. One of the key aspects to that is there's an opportunity for questions. I certainly remember hearing many employees in orientations I've done myself asking, is this really anonymous? Can I really say what I think? And I think just having a person who can look at you square in the eye and say, yes, you can say what you think, the data are going to be held in confidence, your identity will not be ascribed to your ratings, is a very important component. Yet a third here, the 34%, are leaving it up to letter or email, so a much less dynamic sort of approach. So while orientation may be best done in-house, handling the data gets to be a different thing. So it's one thing to have HR sort of explain the process, but when you flip it around and start talking about who's going to be handling the data, that again, from a trust perspective, can produce a different result. So let's take a look at this notion again then of who scores the survey and who generates the reports. So notion being, again, whoever's generating those reports, handling the survey data, are going to have perhaps some visibility into things that employees may be a little bit less comfortable sharing broadly. So we see a pretty strong bias toward the external here. The internal certainly does exist, sort of that software run by HR approach, but it seems that the majority is in the really supporting more the vendor, kind of outside of the organization, handling the data. Again, I think the primary reason for that has to be around the trust that it creates and the notion that you've got a company who specifically specializes in protecting that data. Of course, also, I suppose the pessimist could also say they're more professional in making sure that it's accurate, etc. So clearly, the outside support, but not without some internal in terms of processing the survey and generating reports. Now, probably the single strongest way you can engender trust in your employees has to do with protecting anonymity. So this is one of the kind of the core precepts, the notion that I can provide feedback to my boss that will not come back to me, and that I have real faith in that is absolutely critical. So probably the single strongest way that we look at that, or that groups try to protect that anonymity, has to do with a minimum number of raters per rater category. So how many peers or how many direct reports need to be included in the data to provide a result. If you only have one person reporting to you and you have one person, that one person responds to your survey, it's going to be very clear that the average score of 2.0 on a 5-point scale came from that one person. If, on the other hand, you have 3 or 4 or 5 people in there and you have an average score of 2.0, well, gee, there could have been some 5s, there could have been some 1s, and so that ends up protecting the anonymity a little bit better. So let's take a look, and in this case, I think we're actually going to get a chance to take a look at some of our historical data. One of the great things in this report is that we're able to look back over the 4 previous years, and so when we saw interesting trends that cut across multiple years, we captured that, and so in some ways, the report actually contains sort of 4 years worth of data, not just one. In this case, I think we're just looking at our most recent results back in 2009. And we've seen a pretty significant shift here. 3 used to be the clear standout winner, if you will, in terms of that minimum number. So the feeling that, and if you do the math, 3, if you've got 3 raters in there, it gets pretty tricky to sort of figure it out in terms of kind of who said what, which is really what we're trying to prevent. What we've seen here is actually a fairly strong shift over time toward bigger numbers. So you see, as many as 4, 5, 6, even more than 6 is showing up. Now, there is also this big jump at the end in terms of no minimum. So there is a little jump up there to 19%. But in general, I think what you're seeing is a fairly strong trend upward in terms of the minimums that are required. So really important to think about. This is also one that's important to think about when you're looking at the specific jobs. There are certain organizations for whom, if you picked 4, 5, or 6, you would get you'd end up with no data because nobody has 6 direct reports and things along those lines. So you've got to be a little careful here. But I think in terms of the trends that we're seeing, clearly what we're seeing is a trend toward protecting that anonymity in a much more careful way. So these are the things that companies are doing that we're seeing in terms of protecting the trust of the employees. The other dimension we talked about was rating accuracy. So one of the key things is who chooses the raters, right? So if I'm receiving feedback and I don't participate in who's rating me, someone else chooses, how accurate am I going to feel that the data are if I don't either I don't know who it is and I didn't participate? Do these people even know me? Were they the right individuals, etc.? So when we look at what companies have done here, rater selection also has seen some pretty interesting shifts compared to previous results. So in this case, the norm really, again, that sort of strongest finding was it was really either the participant only or the participant with some manager approval. In this case, we're seeing a strong shift actually away from participant involvement and more toward sort of manager and HR. So if you look at the HR, kind of just using the organizational chart, and the manager, you've got 35% there where the participant may not even be involved in actually choosing the raters. It may be that they see who those raters were, or at least a list of the invitees, but clearly there's a shift in our data here that suggests that organizations are involving participants less. This is one area, again, that I think actually very strongly contradicts some of the sort of best practice advice, if you will, out there, in the sense that the buy-in that you get from the participant being involved can have a huge effect on someone's a belief in the data. Again, there is that the notion that you don't want the friends and family plan, so having some manager or HR approval perhaps may be appropriate, but this is one that does contradict somewhat the typical sort of literature on how you approach these data. The other thing in terms of rating accuracy has to do with training raters. So training raters is one of the things, again, in the research that's proven time and time again to be highly effective in increasing accuracy. There's some sort of known biases and errors that can come into play, and in doing ratings, particularly rating behavior, as we know, people can be very effective observers of behavior, and then they can also have, if you will, the sort of rose color or other colored glasses. And so how do you train them becomes a key question. And again, the research is pretty clear that training does improve accuracy. So what are companies doing in order to get the gains of that training? Well, what we see here is I believe it was 74% of companies do some form of training. And then of those, this is the kind of training that we saw them do. At minimum, you see some text included in the survey, and parenthetically, we've seen just in our own practice incredibly impressive results just from really well thought out instructions in that survey that really are sort of training oriented. We've seen large shifts in the same population in terms of the depth of comments. That's one of our kind of pioneering research areas, and we found that you can really make a huge difference there just in that simple training. That sort of stand-up in-person training, big shift here. Parenthetically, one of our thoughts there, if you knew we're involved in the training industry back in 2009, it was certainly one of the areas in HR that got hit hardest kind of post 2008. So that was kind of one of our takes on what might be explaining some of these findings. But clearly, in-person training is back kind of stronger than it was. Email as well. So a wide range of training it gets used here. And I think, again, that probably reflects very much sort of tailoring it, tailoring the program to the organization and what's going to work well there. Little surprised that the web training, which holds so much promise, doesn't seem to be quite as strong as we might have thought. So another aspect of when you think about credibility in the data has, as I mentioned, to do with accuracy of interpretation. So when it comes to interpretation, a lot of what you're thinking about really is reports. And what we found was that over half of respondents reported that a clear and easy report was essential. It's an interesting finding. It seems a little bit intuitive, but I think that the key input here is essential. Sort of, the notion that it's not optional. It's absolutely a critical, necessary, unambiguous design component. So really thinking about the report format and clarity and how useful is it going to be for the participant. I really can't overstate the importance here. I once did a talk on kind of the can-do versus the should-do in 360 feedback, and you can, in this day and age with the computer technology that's available, you can do an inordinately large number of complex analyses and put them out on a report. But if you've ever received feedback and the emotions that come with that, a more complex report don't necessarily help. And I think that what we're seeing here is that companies are really starting to see that report clarity and ease of use is just absolutely critical. Another component to interpretation, I mentioned kind of the emotional component and the complexity here, has to do with how you interpret from the perspective of what kind of help do you get. So one thing that we see is you've got 60% of companies that are actually making a coach available to help with interpretation, and certainly a coach ought to be doing a lot more than interpretation. But I can assure you that it starts with that. That if the person getting feedback is not clear on how to read that report, that's where you've got to start, because not being able to read it is going to make it really hard to create any kind of change and get them moving on to accepting the results, etc. So I think from an interpretation standpoint, it's good that there is that sort of support. Again, when you overlay the emotions that sometimes come from getting feedback on these things, it's just helpful to have someone sitting beside you going, no, this is how you read the report. Pretty straightforward, or one can certainly hope. Okay, so those are our first two conditions for change. Let's shift now and look at our third condition for change, which is accountability. I think accountability is one that's difficult in many cases for HR, but I think it's a really important component to consider. When you really think about accountability, accountability is actually holding someone down for getting things done, getting those results. It's not saying, gee, I'd like to do this. It's following up to say, did you actually do it? So accountability, I think, is one that is slippery, perhaps, and difficult for HR groups to get in, but becomes a really critical back-end support. Sometimes you get caught up in the process. There's a lot of process involved in collecting data, in generating reports, and distributing reports, and scheduling, and all these sorts of things. But it's what you do after you get that actual report that makes the biggest difference, and I think that's where accountability has its place. So one of the simplest aspects of accountability has to do with the reports in terms of who gets them. So who receives a copy of the report? Very interesting question. It seems on the surface that a simple answer would be, well, certainly the participant does. But we actually asked, and it turned out that this actually is a little bit on the decline. So whereas it used to be more or less ubiquitous that the participant was getting the report, and that was actually very consistent across the last decade, that seems to be shifting a little bit, where again we're seeing human resources and the direct manager getting much more involved. So in what we're seeing is that in some ways the 360 process is perhaps shifting a little bit more in the direction of sort of assessment-based results rather than simply having it be a participant-driven approach. Again, a lot of debate out there in terms of how what it should be and whatnot. But again, what we're seeing here is that HR and managers are getting more involved, and it's the process is becoming a little bit sort of less self-paced. And one of the consequences of that, again, is there's a lot more teeth in the process. People are being held a lot more accountable. We see here the coach, of course, is another way that you can involve somebody. Simply just having a third party that's going to meet with you to talk about the results and say, okay, so what have you been doing? Let's talk about that, can provide its own form of accountability. So what other forms of accountability? Another aspect of accountability has to do, again, with development support. So if I'm not going to send the report off to HR or to the person's manager, what am I going to be doing at least to be holding them accountable for actually doing something with the results? So we give people a wide range of options on this one and ask what kind of support are people participating in. So clearly, consistently this notion of having a plan that you work on with the manager, so there's some involvement from the manager, whether they're actually seeing the report or not, is a critical component. I think involving, any employee who's trying to change and develop should be involving their manager in one way, shape, or another. So certainly this 2/3 finding was pretty strong. We see the action planning, so at minimum, sort of at the 41% level, at minimum coming up with a plan, looking at it, and having some accountability toward actually doing something with the results. We see that live training picking up a little bit, and in this case, the online training seems to be a bit more popular and be picking up in terms of what do we do with the results. So nice to see the real shift toward a stronger bit of support. And again, if you're a participant and you're looking at feedback, and it's not just here's your report, it's here's your report, and next you'll be meeting with your manager. Next, we expect you to put a plan together and maybe get that to HR. Next, you'll be going into a workshop. It just sends a different message in terms of, yes, we actually expect that you will do something with the results. So this leads up to perhaps our the most controversial topic, or most hotly debated, if nothing else, in 360 over the last, probably 2 decades actually, which has to do with the element of accountability around how to use the results.
And while we're waiting for you all to fill out the poll, I just wanted to remind you to submit your questions. We're going to make sure that every question gets answered by following up after the webinar or on LinkedIn. We're going to have a group, 360-degree feedback for change. But also, in the interest of time, we're probably going to just pick a few of the questions to answer in the aggregate. So if you haven't already filled out the poll, take a shot at submitting a question.
Well, this is, as I mentioned, one of the most hotly sort of debated. There have been symposia on this topic. There have been, I've seen screaming matches on this topic. People get very polarized over this one. I know in particular, there are a couple almost camps on this one in terms of appropriateness of it for development versus other sorts of decisions. I may not, in my particular view, be able to get those results. So when you close the poll, if I can't see them, I may need to get that read out to me.
Okay. I'll go ahead and close that poll. And we thank you for submitting your answers there. And let's share. And hopefully everybody can see that. Dale, can you see the results up there?
I'm not getting them, but it's pretty simple. Can you just read the numbers for me?
Sure, sure. Go ahead, Justine.
57% think HR-involved decisions, and 43% think self-directed development decisions only.
Okay, great. Well, so we've got in favor of sort of the use for decision making and against that self-directed development decisions only, which pretty close to split. Maybe a little bit of a bias there toward decision making. And interestingly, fairly reflective of what we found in our study in terms of what companies tend to do. So if we look here, 37% of companies are really using it for self-directed development decisions only, and this is the that notion of just it's your report, do what you want with it, but it's really about development and for your own edification. The other categories, if you will, sort of group into some form of HR involved decision making, which is how our split was here. So actually the audience was pretty close. The interesting thing here is we split it out. So we tried to get, this has been, again, as I mentioned, a hotly debated topic. So we tried to get some involvement from a few sides of the camp to try to get the question right. And I'm not sure we exactly got it, but it's pretty good. So the split that I'll show in just a moment, then it has to do with, should you use it for both development and decision making, just straight personnel decisions, promotion, hiring, firing, that kind of thing, or really just development planning, but not any personnel decisions. So when you split those, but again, that development planning would involve some form of HR or your manager, et cetera. So not just that I can throw it on the shelf and hide its solution. So when we look at those results, you can see that certainly personnel decisions, right? People are pretty clear that this isn't the right way to demote, fire, even perhaps directly promote, although it's certainly a very common tool to sort of inform in an indirect way succession and those kinds of things. But this notion of using it for development and personnel decisions, and then also planning decisions. But I think the shift that we're seeing, or the focus that we're seeing here, is that really it's about, let's use this for decision making. There's a lot of value in the data we're getting. Let's make sure that action is being taken, and maybe what that takes is getting HR and managers a little bit more involved, because when we leave it just up to individuals, they may not be doing the hard work on their own. So again, I think part of that is the involvement of coaches and whatnot, so that there's at least some sort of involvement from the outside, again, that notion of accountability. So I think in many ways what we're seeing here is that accountability is kind of winning the day as groups and companies look at their data. So the last bit we wanted to do is just to share some results in terms of the future of 360 feedback. So we had a lot of folks here who were involved in 360s and running programs from a lot of different companies. So what's going on with them in the sense of how much support do you have? One of the interesting things in any HR program or people-oriented process is how much is senior management really behind this, or is this just another kind of add-on that they don't get or whatnot, which sometimes can be a struggle for HR managers. We found in our data that actually over 2/3 reported senior management to be supportive or highly supportive of 360. So clearly, senior management sees this as a critical tool to help develop and build their teams, and then also, as we're starting to see, perhaps assess their management teams. In terms of looking forward, how much do they see their programs expanding, continuing, etc. We saw almost 2/3 or 3/4 expecting to continue or actually expand their 360s in the coming year. So, very heartened that this process seems to be an important part of the senior, the consciousness of the senior leadership in terms of building a strong leadership team. And the notion is, let's keep doing this and expanding that. So. I think we've got about 10 minutes left here to ask and answer questions. Want to turn this over, I guess, to Justine and see what you can tell us in terms of the questions people have, but also would like to point to a LinkedIn group that was just started on this very topic. I think there's a lot of groups out there in terms of just 360 feedback and some of the tactical specifics and research and whatnot, but we felt there was a real need for focusing on this idea of tips and ideas for, I'm trying to actually move the dial here, what can we do with 360s, and so wanted to focus that. And obviously, if you want more details, we didn't cover every topic, but if you want more details on the study itself, you can find that at this link here and be happy to tell you more. So, Justine, were there questions from the audience?
We do have a few questions. And again, if your question doesn't get answered now, we'll make sure that we follow up and answer it after the webinar. But we do have a few questions about off-the-shelf surveys. Here's one. Our organization is a bit restricted in terms of budget for this project, so we've decided to go with an off-the-shelf tool instead of a custom survey. What suggestions can you offer to get the most from an off-the-shelf survey?
Yeah, it's always a key sort of resource discussion. The time and energy as well as the cost to customize can be a little tricky. I think off-the-shelf tools, the key is make sure there's some good research on them. That's one of the key values you get. You don't have any any custom survey. You don't have any pre-validation or any of that. Look for norms. Having some norms to reference is another key value add there that can help move people forward. So make sure it's a solid, well-built tool. Also, most off-the-shelf tools do allow you sort of multiple levels, so you may more easily and more cost-effectively be able to get different levels. So, for example, frontline manager versus executive, the job does shift a fair amount, strategy, say, versus more implementing. And so maybe try to tailor a little bit so that you're picking off the shelf by level more so than by job content. But there are a lot of great tools out there, so I would not shy away from them. It's just, again, a matter of fit to your organization.
And here we have another question from Laura. She's asking, is there a recommended company size you suggest for launching this feedback loop? I have about 130 employees in total. The staff was requested a 360-degree feedback, but there's concern from the leadership on participation due to confidentiality.
Right. Yeah. I just completed a 360 with an executive of a company with 25 employees, and we really had no difficulty getting that confidentiality. It does get, a little bit more intimate, but the truth is most of us work most closely with a small group of folks. So whether your department has 25 people or your company has 25 people, I think you can do a successful project regardless of size. Though, those concerns around executive leadership around confidentiality, I think that to me that goes more toward trust in the process, and so I probably in designing it would spend a little bit more time on what do we need to do to build that trust, and you should have a partner that can help you think that through, in terms of if you've got a consultant or a vendor that you're working with, that really ought to be some of the work they're doing, is helping you tailor your process to build that trust, and frankly go slow. One other thought there is one of the best ways to build trust is have the executive team go first. That can show people the process before it's about them.
Great. And I think we have time for one more quick question. This one's from Dominique. What rating scale do you recommend? Some clients use the high end of the scale even when encouraged to use the whole range. This seems to mask development opportunities and dilute identification of real strengths. What do you think?
Ah, yes, the rating scale question, one of my favorites. Almost always comes up. So the 5-point rating scale, there's a lot of research out there that the 5-point rating scale is really the best choice. It's it's psychometrically, it's almost identical to a 7-point scale, but it's quicker and easier to use. People are really familiar with that rating scale, so 5 points is really the recommended length. Parenthetically, and I didn't cover it, but it is in the full report, I believe it was 87% of companies now use a 5-point scale, so I think that's indicative that, if you will, research has won the day there. The second thing is around the points that you use in terms of agreement versus frequency. I have a slight bias toward frequency because I think you can shape your questions a little bit differently. But I don't know that and we actually have some research that shows that with a frequency scale, if you make it more positively, in other words, you make more positive items at the top, don't make it even, where it's, the midpoint, the 3 of the 5 is exactly in the middle. you can actually shift some of those scores. So if you make those top anchors a little bit more positive, you can improve variability. And I'd be happy to send you a copy of the article that Andrew wrote on that. It was a great one around, again, just we were able to actually significantly, with a sample of like 4,000 responses, significantly shift ratings down and get rid of some of that positive bias that you tend to get in some 360s.
Great, wonderful. And then we did get a few questions that I think I can answer about whether or not we're going to get a recording. So we are definitely going to send everyone who registered for this webinar a recording of the full webinar. So you should be receiving it next week.
Okay. Well, I think we've used our time. I want to thank you all for spending a little time with us today. And again, if you've got questions on either of these, as you can tell, I really love talking about this stuff. So feel free to reach out anytime, and have a great Tuesday.